You drive past one every single day. Bright sign, full parking lot, doors that slide open like they're happy to see you. You've probably thought about it. Just for a second. What if that place was yours? Here's the thing nobody tells you. Owning a supermarket is not a wealth story. It's a survival story. And the handful of people who actually got rich doing it didn't get rich the way you think. So let's find out what really happens if you buy one. Picture a normal, healthy supermarket doing about $37 million a year in sales, 40,000 square feet, thousands of customers a week, carts rolling through checkout from open to close. On paper, this looks like one of the safest businesses on earth because food is the one thing humans never stop buying. So, how much would actually land in your pocket? Here's the number that changes everything. The average grocery store keeps less than 2 cents of every dollar that crosses the register. Not $2. 2 cents. A customer hands you a $100 bill. The farmer gets a cut, the distributor gets a cut. The trucking company, the manufacturer, your landlord, the power company, your own employees. By the time everyone's been paid, you're left holding about $1.70. That's not a typo. That's the entire industry, top to bottom. So, why would anyone build a career doing this? One word: volume. You're not trying to make a lot of money on one sale. You're trying to make a tiny amount of money thousands of times a day, every single day, for decades without stopping. Think about George Jenkins. In 1930, in the middle of the Great Depression, he was working as a store manager making $30 a week when he decided to open his own grocery store in Winter Haven, Florida. He called it Publix. He didn't just want to sell food cheaper than the guy down the street. He wanted the people stocking his shelves to actually own a piece of what they were building. So starting in 1974, he began giving employees company stock instead of just a paycheck. Nobody could buy in from outside. You had to work there to own it. Decades later, that one decision turned ordinary cashiers, baggers, and produce clerks into millionaires. Not executives, not investors sitting in an office somewhere, people who spent 30 or 40 years bagging groceries and stocking dairy cases, retiring with stock worth well over $1 million because they owned a sliver of a business that quietly compounded year after year without anyone outside the company even noticing. That's the secret hiding inside this entire industry. The real money was never in the markup. It's in what happens when a razor-thin margin gets repeated millions of times for half a century without ever stopping. Now, here's a completely different path to the same kind of wealth. In 1905, a woman named Florence Butt opened a small grocery store in Kerrville, Texas, with $60 in savings. Her husband was sick. She needed to feed her family. She had no idea she was starting what would eventually become H-E-B, one of the largest privately held companies in America. Her descendants, the Butt family, are now worth tens of billions of dollars, and the company still refuses to sell, still refuses to go public, over a century later. One family built an empire from a single $60 grocery stand. Another company built millionaires out of its own employees by handing out stock instead of bonuses. Same industry, same 2-cent margin. Two completely different ways of turning that margin into real wealth. But before you start dreaming about either one of those outcomes, you need to understand what it actually costs just to walk through the front door of this business. There is no single price tag on a supermarket. There's a ladder, and the cheap end of that ladder is mostly a trap. At the very bottom, you could open a small corner grocery store for around $100,000. That gets you a tiny footprint, a couple of coolers, and barely enough inventory to look like a real store. It will never generate anywhere close to supermarket level revenue. To build a genuine full-scale supermarket, one with a produce section, a butcher counter, a bakery, and a parking lot big enough to matter, you're looking at somewhere between $3.5 million and $16 million, depending entirely on where you build it. And location is where the first hidden cost ambushes you. Commercial retail rent in an average American shopping center runs close to $24 per square foot every year. In a competitive coastal market, that number can climb past $60 per square foot. Multiply that across a 40,000 square foot store and you start to understand why grocery chains fight so hard over real estate before they've sold a single item. Then comes the build out, and this is where the money really starts disappearing. Land, construction, and the physical shell of the store can run anywhere from $400,000 for a small conversion to $15 million for a ground up build in an expensive market. Refrigeration alone can cost between $250,000 and $750,000. A single 20-foot by 20-foot walk-in cooler can run past $25,000 on its own. And a full store needs several of them, each holding a different temperature zone for meat, dairy, produce, and frozen goods. Then you need something to actually put inside all that refrigeration. Initial inventory to fill the shelves and make opening day look complete costs somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000. Shelving and fixtures, the gondola racks, the bakery counters, the deli cases run another 50 to 150,000. Point of sale systems, security cameras, and technology add 30 to 120,000 more. Shopping carts alone can cost $15 to $40,000 for a full fleet, and that's before backroom equipment like pallet jacks and box balers. And then there's the cost nobody warns you about before you sign anything: the liquor license. In states where licenses are capped, the market price for the legal right to sell alcohol can range from $15,000 in a quiet county to well over $400,000 in a competitive city. Alcohol is one of the highest margin categories in the entire store, which is exactly why the right to sell it costs so much. Skip it, and you've cut off one of your best profit centers before you've even opened the doors. Add it all up, and a serious full format supermarket is a multi-million-dollar commitment before a single customer has ever walked inside. Now you're open, lights on, carts rolling. This is where most people assume the hard part is over. It's actually where the real fight begins. 65 to 75 cents of every single dollar you make goes straight back out the door, just to pay for the products sitting on your shelves. What's left has to cover your staff, your electricity, your rent, your insurance, your maintenance, and finally, your own paycheck. Start with labor, which typically eats 10 to 16% of total sales. Here's what most owners underestimate. Grocery retail has one of the highest staff turnover rates in the entire economy, around 40% a year for part-time workers, climbing past 55% at some multi-location chains. Every time someone quits, you're paying to recruit, hire, and retrain the next person, while the shelves they use to stock start looking a little emptier. Then there's energy. Supermarkets are among the most electricity-hungry buildings that exist, mostly because refrigeration runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, whether the store is packed or empty. A typical store burns through enough electricity annually to cost around $230,000, and refrigeration plus lighting alone can account for 50 to 80% of that bill. Add rent, typically 4 to 10% of revenue. Add everything else: marketing, insurance, maintenance, security, technology licensing, another 3 to 8%. And then there's the cost that never shows up on any invoice at all: shrinkage. That's the industry's polite word for inventory that simply vanishes through theft, spoilage, or error before it's ever sold. Across the sector, shrinkage averages between 1.6 and 3% of sales. That might sound small. Remember, your entire net profit margin is only 1.7%. A 2% shrink rate in a business running a 1.7% profit isn't a rounding error. It's the difference between a good year and a loss. Break that shrinkage down and the picture gets uncomfortable. Employee theft, cash skimming, giving free items to friends accounts for roughly 42% of all shrink losses, and the average internal incident costs the store close to $1,900. Shoplifting accounts for another 37%, though each individual theft is smaller, averaging around $461. The rest comes from administrative mistakes, mispriced items, and vendor shortages. On top of theft, there's spoilage, which hammers the fresh departments hardest of all. Fresh produce alone loses an average of 11.6% of stock to spoilage, and some leafy greens see loss rates above 60%. Across the country, supermarkets throw away an estimated $15 billion worth of unsold fruit and vegetables every single year. Run the math on that, and a single $100 inventory loss requires a store to generate over $5,000 in brand new sales just to break even on that one mistake. So where does the actual profit come from if the margins are this thin everywhere? Not where you'd guess. The center aisles, the canned goods, the cereal, the soda exist mainly to get you in the building and keep you coming back weekly. The margins there are thin, often around 26% gross before operating costs. The real profit lives on the perimeter of the store. Fresh produce carries a gross margin around 30 to 40%, despite the spoilage risk. The deli and prepared foods counter runs even higher, 40 to over 50%. because customers are paying for convenience, not just ingredients. The in-store bakery might be the single most profitable department in the entire building, with margins routinely exceeding 55%. Flour, sugar, and yeast are cheap. A warm loaf of bread smells like something worth paying a premium for. Meat and seafood run 25 to 30%. And floral, despite taking up barely more than 1% of the store's total footprint, generates gross margins around 46%, making it one of the best uses of square footage in the whole building. Then there's the quiet war between national brands and private label goods. National brands draw customers in because people already trust them, but because those manufacturers hold all the negotiating power, they leave the retailer with only about 26% gross margin. Private label, the store's own branded version of the same product, flips that equation. By cutting out the manufacturer's marketing budget and negotiating direct production deals, a store can build its own version for 40 to 50% less than what it costs to stock the national brand, price it 20 to 30% below the branded product, and still walk away with a gross margin closer to 35%. The sweet spot most successful supermarkets land on is having private label make up somewhere between 35 and 40% of total products. Push much higher and customers feel like their choices are being taken away. Sit much lower and you're leaving margin on the table every single day. Now, consider a completely different kind of supermarket success story, one built on breaking almost every rule in this industry. In 1967, a man named Joe Coulombe was running a small chain of convenience stores in California called Pronto Market, and he was watching a giant named 7-Eleven expand into his territory with prices he could never match. Instead of competing on price, he did the opposite. He shrank his store count, cut his product selection down to a tight, curated list, and started stocking unusual, high-quality, private label food that nobody else carried. He called it Trader Joe's. He never tried to be the biggest. He never tried to carry 30,000 products like a normal supermarket. He built a business almost entirely on private label goods with margins far higher than a typical grocery chain and a devoted customer base willing to drive past 3 other stores just to shop there. Decades later, Trader Joe's generates more sales per square foot than almost any grocery chain in the country, a business built by refusing to play the same game everyone else was playing. There's also a financial mechanism working quietly in the background that most customers never think about, called the cash conversion cycle. Customers pay instantly in cash or card, and grocery inventory turns over fast, so a supermarket usually collects its money within a day or two of a sale. But suppliers, especially large manufacturers, are often paid on 30, 60, or even 90-day terms. That gap means the store is sitting on the supplier's money for weeks before the bill comes due. Multiply that across an entire store's worth of inventory, and a well-run supermarket effectively gets free, interest-free financing every single month, funded entirely by its own suppliers. And here's where it gets interesting. On paper, 1.7% looks like an almost embarrassingly small profit margin. But that number is deceptive because it isn't applied once. A successful independent grocery store turns its entire inventory over somewhere between 17 and 19 times a year. That same tiny margin, applied to the same dollar of capital 19 separate times over 12 months, compounds into a return that looks nothing like 1.7% by the time the year ends. And volume is not an accident. It's engineered deliberately down to the inch of floor space. The first several feet inside the entrance are what the industry calls the decompression zone, a deliberately uncluttered area, often filled with bright produce or flowers, designed to signal freshness before you've even picked up an item. Roughly 7 out of 10 shoppers naturally drift to the right when they walk in, so stores are laid out to guide traffic in a counterclockwise loop, because data shows counterclockwise shoppers spend a couple of dollars more per visit than shoppers moving the other direction. The absolute essentials, milk, eggs, bread, basic meat, sit at the very back and around the far edges of the store, forcing you to walk past thousands of higher margin items just to reach the things you actually came in for. Eye level is buy level. Products placed at a standard adult eye line sell dramatically faster than the identical products placed above or below, which is exactly why manufacturers pay real money, sometimes several hundred to over $1,000 per item per store, just to secure the shelf position. Lower shelves are strategically loaded with bright, sugary products angled toward the eye line of a small child sitting in the cart, not the adult pushing it. End cap displays, the promotional shelving at the end of each aisle, reliably boost sales of the featured item by 20 to 30% during a promotion. And the checkout lane, where you're standing still with nothing to do but wait, is lined with candy, gum, and cold drinks, converting a few idle minutes into pure, high margin impulse revenue. None of this is guesswork. It's some of the most heavily researched psychology in all of retail because the margins are so thin that a tiny shift in your behavior can be the difference between a profitable quarter and a losing one. Now remember what we said about the volatility built into every part of this business. Your costs are fixed, rent doesn't change month to month, refrigeration runs whether the store is busy or empty, but your revenue is exposed to forces completely outside your control. Take online delivery. A typical $100 basket bought in store generates roughly $4 of net profit for the store. Take that exact same order online, and now an employee has to walk the aisles, handpick each item, pack it, and either hand it off or personally deliver it. By the time labor and logistics are added, that same order can flip from a $4 profit into a $13 loss. Every grocery chain in the country is currently wrestling with this exact math because customers want the convenience, but very few are willing to pay what that convenience actually costs to deliver, take an empty shelf. When you reach for a product that isn't there, over 60% of shoppers will settle for a substitute, but up to 25% will simply walk away without buying anything. And in categories where brand loyalty runs strong, over 40% will leave the store entirely and buy it somewhere else. Stockouts alone are estimated to cost retailers around 4.1% of total sales, a devastating number in a business running on a 1.7% margin. And here's the part that stings. Somewhere between 70 and 90% of stockouts aren't caused by suppliers failing to deliver. They're caused by internal failures, employees simply not restocking the shelf fast enough. Take inflation. When wholesale prices rise and a store passes that cost onto the shelf price, customers don't just grumble and pay it. They trade down. They switch from the national brand to the private label. They abandon premium items entirely. Some walk out the door for good and start shopping at a discount chain instead. Add chronic understaffing, where the newest, least experienced hands in the building are the ones responsible for restocking shelves and catching spoilage before it happens. Add a food safety recall, an event no single store can predict or control, and a supermarket can lose an entire category of revenue overnight while absorbing the reputational damage that follows. Add a supply chain disruption, a port delay, a trucking shortage, a severe weather event, and the tightly timed inventory system that keeps your costs low suddenly produces empty shelves instead at exactly the moment competitors down the street still have stock. This is the structural trap of the entire industry. Your costs behave like a business with predictable, fixed obligations. Your revenue behaves like a business exposed to consumer psychology, competitor pricing, and macroeconomic swings you have zero control over. That mismatch is exactly why so many grocery chains, even massive, well-run ones with decades of experience, eventually collapse. And the volatility doesn't stop with customer behavior. It extends to the entire competitive landscape sitting around every independent store. Walmart leans on sheer global scale to dictate everyday low pricing across the whole industry. Costco has built an entirely different model around bulk purchasing and a membership fee that renews at close to 90% every single year, meaning over half the company's operating profit doesn't come from selling groceries at all. It comes from the card sitting in your wallet. Hard discount chains like Aldi strip out almost everything a traditional supermarket considers standard, carrying only around 1,500 products instead of 30,000. Running stores with as few as 3 to 7 employees on shift, and using that stripped down structure to undercut traditional grocery prices. By 15 to 30%, an independent supermarket cannot win a straight price war against any of these companies. Studies comparing shopping baskets consistently show discount chains pricing 30 to 40% below traditional regional supermarkets. So the smaller operators that survive don't try to win on price. They win by moving fast, stocking hyperlocal and specialty items a national chain's rigid supply chain will never bother carrying, and building the kind of in-person relationship with regular customers that a self-checkout kiosk simply cannot replicate. Technology has become the newest front in this fight. Electronic shelf labels, small digital price tags cost between $5 and $15 per unit, meaning a full store rollout can run past $100,000. That sounds enormous for something as simple as a price tag, until you consider what it replaces. Hundreds of labor hours a week spent manually swapping paper tags and the pricing errors that come with doing it by hand. Digital tags let a store change prices instantly across the entire building, dropping the price on produce about to expire before it has to be thrown away, or matching a competitor's promotion in real time. Artificial intelligence is now doing a version of the same job for inventory, watching sales patterns, anticipating seasonal shifts, and automatically triggering reorders before a shelf actually goes empty, directly attacking that stockout problem. Self-checkout lanes cut the labor cost of the single most repetitive job in the building. And behind the scenes, some of the largest chains are now building automated micro-fulfillment centers, small robotic warehouses attached to the back of a physical store that can pick and pack an online order roughly 5 times faster than a human walking the aisles, directly targeting that painful gap between in-store profit and online loss. None of this technology is optional anymore. It's a defensive investment, made specifically to protect a margin that was already razor thin long before Walmart, Aldi, and online delivery ever entered the picture. For chains that do manage to grow past a single location, the path forward almost always runs through vertical integration, cutting out a middleman supplier entirely and controlling a piece of the supply chain directly. The clearest modern example is Costco's rotisserie chicken. For years, Costco sold a whole rotisserie chicken for $4.99, a price that hadn't moved despite rising poultry costs because that chicken functioned as a loss leader, a product priced specifically to pull customers through the door even if it barely broke even on its own. As wholesale chicken supply tightened and threatened that price point, Costco made an extraordinary decision. Instead of raising the price, the company built its own $450 million poultry complex in Nebraska, contracting directly with more than 100 local farmers and operating its own hatchery, feed mill, and processing plant. The result was direct control over roughly 100 million chickens a year, covering about 40% of the company's total domestic need. Most independent grocers will never build their own poultry farm, but the underlying lesson scales down perfectly. Controlling one more link of the supply chain directly is one of the few reliable ways to claw back margin in a business where nearly everyone else is already fighting over the same thin slice of profit. Now, meet the company that should have proven none of this could ever bring you down. For most of the 20th century, one grocery chain wasn't just successful, it was the largest retailer of any kind in the United States, period. Not just the largest grocery chain, it pioneered the self-service supermarket format that every single store on earth still copies today. At its peak in the 1940s, it controlled roughly 1 out of every $10 spent on groceries in the entire country. And in 2015, after 156 years in business, it was gone. Liquidated, stores sold off piece by piece to competitors. The very system that built its empire, tight standardization, rigid cost control, decades-old labor agreements, became too expensive and too rigid to unwind once the industry shifted underneath it. The company that taught the entire world how to run an efficient supermarket eventually got outrun by the businesses it had inspired. That's the lesson sitting underneath this entire industry. Being good at this business isn't enough. You have to keep being good at it forever, while the ground keeps moving under your feet. So back to the original question. What if you owned a supermarket? In a strong year, running a disciplined operation, keeping shrinkage near the low end of the range, keeping your private label mix in that sweet spot, and your perimeter departments, produce, deli, bakery, and meat, pulling their weight, you're looking at a net profit somewhere around $60,000 to $800,000. And if you're running a larger, fully scaled operation, generating $15 million or more in revenue, owner compensation between salary and profit distributions can range from $400,000 to well past $5 million a year for the most efficient multi-store operators, the kind of numbers that built empires like Publix, H-E-B, and Trader Joe's in the first place. Now, here's the realistic scenario. Shrinkage creeps toward the higher end of the range, driven by a rough patch of employee turnover and a spike in theft. A produce delivery gets delayed and you lose a chunk of fresh inventory to spoilage before it ever hits the shelf. Inflation pushes wholesale prices up, and to protect your margin, you raise shelf prices only to watch a meaningful slice of your price-sensitive customers drift toward a discount competitor down the road. Add a stretch of chronic understaffing that leads to empty shelves during your busiest hours. Run that same $37 million revenue store through this version of the year, and instead of $600,000 to $800,000 in profit, you could be looking at a loss of a few $100,000 in the red, even though your revenue barely moved at all. The difference between a good year and a bad year in this business isn't measured in the millions, the way it might be in oil drilling or shipping. It's measured in a single percentage point of shrinkage, a single percentage point of margin, a handful of decisions made correctly or incorrectly at the store level, week after week for 52 weeks straight. That's the real secret behind every supermarket fortune ever built. From a Depression era store in Florida to a $60 grocery stand in Texas to a curated chain that refused to compete on price. It never looked like a business about buying and selling food. It was always a business about who could survive the longest without a single week going wrong.